and as Heather said, I'm the Director of Programs with Prevent Child Abuse Tennessee. I'm happy to be with you this morning, talking a little bit about working with children and families. I'm going to go ahead and go through the presentation. Heather, will I be able to hear anyone, or will I have to also look at the chat box to get any kind of feedback or questions? Should I just go through the presentation and take questions at the end?
If you want to just go through the presentation, I'll be monitoring the chat box and I'll let you know if they have anything pressing, and then we can review them at the end if there's anything else.
That sounds fabulous. Okay, so I do a lot of training in the Nashville area on working with children and families to build safe, stable, and nurturing environments. And because we run the statewide domestic violence helpline and the parent helpline, a big part of what we do is making sure that children and families are also part of this conversation when it comes to receiving any kind of domestic violence services. Just a quick background too, I spent 5 years working in one of the largest shelters in Florida. I'm originally from Florida, and I served in several capacities, including running our shelter, running our outreach program, support groups, and working specifically with parents and children in both who were both living in shelter and also receiving outreach services. So I'm happy to share hopefully some useful information with you today. So we'll go ahead and start out with the objectives of today's presentation. And that is, of course, to explain the primary goals for effective children's programs, discuss what we're going to refer to as a trilogy of services, and identify creative ways to overcoming obstacles in helping serve children and parents in shelter. Back in 2015, we're getting ready to update this data, but back in 2015, we conducted a survey of Tennessee shelters. And so nationwide, we know that approximately 2/3 of shelter residents are children, and a very large portion of folks who receive outreach services through domestic violence shelters are also children. Shelters that offer outreach services for children see an average of 1.5 child per adult. So in Tennessee, we informally surveyed 27 shelters about how they self-reported services that they provide for children. And 17 of those said they had children's programs, 5 reported no children's programs that said they offered services for children, and 14 reported having a budget or funds for children's programs. So that kind of helps us to see the landscape. That, like I said, we're getting ready to update this data, but that was what we had back in 2015. So one of the main things that we really need to do is to shift the paradigm of thinking. We need to view children as primary clients and not secondary clients in our shelter environments. A little bit about the history of children's services in DV shelters. Advocates who had been working in these environments knew they needed to help children, but they were really concerned that focusing on children would mean less funding for survivors. You know, the reality of the situation is that funding for these types of services is always something we kind of have to advocate for and fight for, and we continue to have to do that. So in the early years, shelters offered more kind of daycare type services where they would really help maybe to watch the children, or have a program where other shelter residents could help with children if folks that were living in shelter needed to go for job interviews or take care of different things that they needed in their transitioning out. The need grew out of advocates noticing in child residents something that's probably not new to any of you, and that was insecurities, aggressive acting out that sometimes disrupted the shelter environment, symptoms of withdrawal. You can imagine a child being taken out of one location and put into a shelter environment could be very disquieting for them and sort of disrupt the balance of their routine, which children really thrive on. And the stress on mothers related to child issues. So we knew that a primary concern was definitely how stressed out moms that were living in shelters were about their children's situation and how their children were coping with what was going on. And we know for a fact the emotional and physical well-being of their children is a main concern for women in shelters. So just, again, this is probably a review, especially those of you that work in this environment every day. We know that domestic violence is a family problem and it affects all household members. And children who witness abuse, though sometimes not targets themselves, are no less victims. I'm sure that when I do these trainings, whether it be for groups or for advocates or for CPS workers, we know a lot of parents will oftentimes say, my child never witnessed the abuse, him or herself. But it's really important for us to remember that the effects of what is happening is very real for these children. This runs the gamut of emotional effects, behavioral effects, cognitive effects and disruptions, behavior to expect how they function in school and just how they're dealing with emotional regulation, particularly in those children that have been in domestic violence situations or family violence situations for long periods of time. And we know from things like the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that a child that doesn't have a safe, stable, and nurturing environment isn't having that foundation of good emotional health from the time that they're young. So this really causes myriad physical and emotional problems. Even if they're not tangible all the time, we know that they're there. And we get externalized and internalized problems. And by externalized problems, sometimes we see this result in aggressive behaviors, sometimes directed at other people or children or animals, problems with authority, discipline problems. And then we have the internalized problems, which is non-aggressive, but impedes children's intellectual and emotional development. So perhaps we're not seeing the typical milestones that children will meet. Perhaps speech is delayed, regression back to some of those behaviors or sort of milestones that have already been met, whether it be, from academic or things like toilet training and all of those sort of milestones and markers that we look for as children continue to grow and mature. So we really have an opportunity when we're serving these families to start at that prevention work. Because in the shelter environment, we're often focused on the intervention work of finding a safe space and helping empower victims so that or survivors so that they can rebuild a life for themselves. But we know that we're also engaged at this level at prevention work, and that's breaking the cycle of domestic violence. Unfortunately, we know from data that we have collected over the years that children who have been exposed to intimate partner violence may be more likely to become involved in violent relationships as adults than children who have not. That means either in becoming victimizers themselves or unfortunately becoming victims of intimate partner violence. And DV advocates are really in a position to be the first and foremost primary crisis responders. So what we do in that environment as we work with families has a profound impact on how this will play out and whether we can continue to work on this prevention aspect of domestic violence. And effective comprehensive DV work involves all levels of care. This includes early intervention and prevention work. We're in a really, really unique position to address long-term prevention of family violence. And we really do this primarily through not only the education and outreach that we provide, that's a part of the work that every shelter does, but also in working with these families and in really working to heal the child witnesses of domestic violence by providing them with effective tactics for personal safety and alternatives to violence. And of course, probably nothing that I've shared with you so far is new information. And I think we get to a crossroads where we're like, yes, we know all this stuff. We know what we need to do, but we have the reality of X, Y, and Z. We have the reality of staffing capacity, of community support, of funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about some things that we can actually do in our environments, or some inroads that we can make to start to address this a little more seriously. So now that we know where we are and what we need, how do we get there, right? This is this yellow brick road. I like this image of, you know, we have a framework in front of us, and yes, we can follow it, but along the way, we're going to need people to join us, to join hands with us, and to sort of build this coalition and this workforce of addressing this issue. So our primary goals here is to ensure needs of child witnesses are heard and considered amidst the chaos of the crisis environment. And I remember, I don't work in the shelter environment anymore, but I remember having sort of my appointment book scheduled for the week and kind of thinking that I know, and I had set aside time to do data and to work on case notes and do community outreach and do all of these things. And then my day never quite played out the way that I had intended, because you have somebody that you have to do an intake, and suddenly the entire afternoon you had scheduled is no longer what you thought it would be. So really, how do we ensure that those needs of those primary clients are met amid the chaos and the unpredictability of what we know the crisis environment looks like? That education component for children and their parents, and really trying to involve children in appropriate decisions, activities, and counseling. And this is something that takes a lot of work, because we need to make sure that just as we strive to educate and give victims and survivors choices and sort of have them be at the helm of their own healing process and their journey, we want to try to do that with children. Giving children choices is really, really, really important, because children really don't have them. They're sort of at the whim of having everybody tell them what to do, whether it's parents or teachers or other adults. They're really at the mercy of the adults around them all the time. And then fostering relationships between staff and children, and helping to strengthen relationships between children and their parents. Because there is some rupturing that happens in that relationship, particularly when the child is removed from an environment that he or she knows. They're really focusing on helping to build that relationship as a part of our shelter services is something that's really important, and sort of starts with training and getting the staff up to a level and cross-training everyone so that they know how to appropriately interact with not only the adults but the children in the shelter environment as well. So we refer to this as the Trilogy of Services, which is the orientation into the shelter environment, or outreach services, if that's how we're reaching children and families, that education component, and then that ongoing counseling, which you'll see the arrow goes both ways, because that counseling with children in this environment is, of course, not like going to a mental health provider. Well, they'll receive very specific kind of counseling or therapies, whether it be play therapy or art therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. We're really looking at more of an educational model of counseling. We take the healing process one step at a time, and that healing process really begins with their first interaction with our services, both for the parent and the child. And it really starts with orientation, and that's welcoming and acclimating children to shelter. Again, this is focused on in shelter services, but this can also refer to outreach as well. And our orientation, at a minimum, should do the following. It should provide the child with basic information about the shelter environment, reassure safety, because just like for the adult, that safety component, you know, I don't know how many of you are familiar with something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but at the very bottom of that is our basic needs, our food and our shelter and our safety. And until we feel confident in that, it's hard for us to go that next step and go up that pyramid. So really reassuring safety is very important. Explain basic rules and expectations. Of course, children need to know what the expectations are of them, of that environment, and it needs to be supported through the parent. So a lot of these exchanges really need to happen with the parent present. Discussing the importance of confidentiality, which can be, depending on the level of the child and the age of the child, can be a very difficult thing to talk about, but there are ways, age-appropriate ways to discuss. This is a safe environment. What you say here is protected, and really discuss that with the parent too, so that that message can be reiterated at that level. Introducing the child to key staff members. Of course, giving the child the opportunity for questions and answers. And just like sometimes we have interactions or meetings and we may not be quick on our feet or think about everything that we want to ask or say at that particular time, really leaving the door open for, in a way that a child understands, you know, we'll see each other again. If you think of anything, I'm always here to answer questions. And assess a child's basic level of understanding through a pretest. So it's really hard to figure out how that relationship is going to continue and how the services are going to be provided unless you kind of know your baseline with each child. Any of you who have interacted with children and adults know that everybody comes with a different baseline. You know, you may have a 3 or a 4-year-old that's extremely verbal and seems to be really aware and really articulate, and then you may have another child that is not at that level. So really understanding the baseline and the emotional state of that child is really important. Ideally, orientation should take place during the child's first full day in shelter. Orientation is really a crucial time for a child because it sets the tone for the child's experience in that particular shelter. That's their first interaction, and it really will, they're going to use that sort of as a jumping board for, am I in a safe place? There's all these unknowns here. How was my first experience with this staff member or with the people in this shelter? It's really important to keep in mind that a child will most probably be experiencing sadness and or confusion over being displaced and leaving the other parent, and so, or the other caregiver. And I think, again, getting back to talking about, in a slide, I'll go back, where we talked about ensuring the needs of child witnesses are heard and considered amidst the chaos of the crisis environment. Getting back to some of those realities we were talking about, you know, you have a very limited number of people who are able to provide these services, and you're very much trying to get somebody into safety. It could be a lethal situation. There's so much chaos. There's so much unpredictability, and you're really focused on dealing with the adult, which is understandable and perfectly appropriate. So, but it's important to realize that one of the primary concerns probably of that adult is the child, and figuring out and letting the parent know we are here for you and for your children. Also, due to exposure to violence, child witnesses often have diminished coping skills. So again, you know, we may not have all the information at that point. We may not know how long this has been going on. I know probably as part of the intake process, those questions are asked, but it takes us time too to kind of fully wrap our heads around each individual and their situation and sort of try to work out in our heads and predict some things that may come of that interaction or of this specific family. But realizing that children also probably have some of those diminished coping skills, particularly if they've seen something very traumatic or if they've been living in this situation for an extended period of time. And really, the child is also probably quite distressed by the emotional state of the parent. And if, like the parent has said, the child may not have witnessed X, Y, and Z, possibly even angry. In working with a lot of parents who came in to do orientations for their children who are receiving outreach counseling in our children's program at the shelter. I would often have parents say, you know, my child is very angry with me, or my child is very violent with me, or my child seems to be taking out their anger, their behaviors on me, and possibly doing the opposite with the abuser. And as I'm sure many of you have done, it's reminding that parent that that child with that parent is in that safe space where they feel comfortable sort of letting go. And so what that looks like is often the child is acting out against the parent who is the non-violent or non-offending parent. And trying to explain that dynamic to the parent is a really important part of that process as well, because oftentimes the parent doesn't understand that. So at orientation, we want a pre-test and an intake assessment. And I know I would love to hear, can you all take a minute maybe in the text box, and Heather, if you can share with me, I'd like to know, is anyone on this call, do your shelters have any kind of a pre-test or intake assessment specifically for children? Heather, did you get any feedback on that?
We got a few. It looks like most people say that they do conduct an intake but don't necessarily have a pre-test process.
Okay.
Some meet with the parent and then meet with the child separately, and there are a couple of questions about examples of what should be on the pre-test, or if there's a way to find kind of a sample document.
Yeah, so I actually have one that I'm going to offer, so that's actually great. And thank you all so much for sharing. I know that we probably have a variety of levels here, because from what I understand, based on my knowledge of shelters, there's very small shelters and there's much larger shelters, so I'm sure that everybody has different capacity and different processes. So I'm going to, and I think it's the next slide, but maybe it might be two coming up. I'm going to show you a sample pre-test. But at the very least, having a portion of the intake assessment that is dedicated to assessing the child is a really, really important part of the services that shelters provide. Because shelters really need to assess children on their basic level of understanding at a minimum of personal safety and the dynamics of domestic violence and intimate personal violence. And along with that, parents should also be assessed on their child's understanding of these issues through a parent-child safety plan or something along those lines. And of course, not forgetting to have the consent forms for providing services to children signed. I know we tend to have those consent forms kind of nailed down, but it's really important not to forget those, especially if there's any possibility you're going to be meeting with children separate from their parents. So I don't know how well you can see this. It was a sort of, this is a sample sort of pre-survey parent-child safety plan. And the way that we kind of did it with the parents was that we would sit with them at intake, and this, if they came into shelter with children, or even if they were getting outreach services, depending on, of course, you assess every situation individually, we would definitely do sort of this pre and then this post. I know that obviously tracking outcomes is an important thing of what we do as well. Our funders, depending on how we're getting our monies, want to see outcomes, want to know that the money being invested in these programs are dollars well spent. So really sitting down with the parent and doing kind of this pre-survey parent-child safety plan. And of course, this can be customized. And the coalition probably, Heather, I don't know if you all have any documents or any kind of forms like this that you have seen or worked on. But what we're looking to do is just to collect some information. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through this with you because it may be hard to see, but of course we want to collect the basic demographic information, and we do one per child. So if a mom comes in with 3 children, we want to make sure that we are doing one of these for each child. We want, of course, the child's full name, the date, the child's age, and then if they have received services before or attended any, it would really be helpful to know that because we have shared confidentiality, and we can probably collect some information if other advocates or folks have interacted with this parent and child before. So safety planning or anything before with the child. And assess the parent's level of their own child's safety. So does the child know how to stay out of a fight? Now, of course, you want to have these for different age groups. And obviously, this is one that is not for a baby or a toddler. This is just a basic one, probably for a child that's over the age, I would say, of 4. Does the child know how to stay out of a fight? Does the child know how to go to a safe place? Does the child know how to call 911 only if it's safe? And then if you'll see, this is a question, if an infant or toddler, mom knows how to put child in a safe place. So this is also assessing mom's level. Has the parent notified the school, daycare, babysitter of the situation and given them any court orders regarding custody? Has the parent discussed a signal for help with the child, kind of like a safe word? Is there someone the parent can trust who can keep the child safe in the event of an emergency? And basically, these are yes or no questions, and you can obviously collect more information after. Do you know your child's father's address and social security number? This is an effort to collect some information that may be important later on. Do you have the following in a safe place for your child? Shot records, pediatrician's phone number, birth certificate, social security card. So you'll know if the parent has ever received any kind of counseling or been in shelter before, they may have been advised to have some of these safety items or have a safe bag or things that we often advise people to do in different versions of safety planning. Do you have the following in a safe place for your child so you can leave quickly? Now, this is sort of a hybrid of outreach and shelter, and again, these can be customized. This is sort of a little sampling of everything. But this, if you were working with somebody who was coming to get outreach counseling services and they have children, right, you would want to have that child component. So enough clothes for the child's favorite object, medication, WIC information, food stamp information, all if applicable. And then really getting from the parent, straight from the parent, do you have any questions about your child's behavior that we may be able to help you with? And then having the parent sign that and having the staff sign that and keeping it as part of sort of the records of what we have so that we can refer to that. Now, this is a pre-survey. So this is something that we are going to collect hopefully at the first, either at intake or the first outreach meeting, really our first interaction that we have with that parent that we know has a child. So looking at this and going through these questions, I want to ask now, are any of these things included in any of the intake or currently what you have in shelter now that we went into detail a little bit?
We've got a couple answers so far. Safety, yes, safety planning is included. Some but not all is included. Part of this we go over with them on crisis calls.
Okay. So does that mean that it's discussed over the phone when folks call the helpline? Is that what that means?
I believe so.
Okay. So I am interested in knowing, also asking if I can, and maybe you all can give me some responses. Is this something that you would be interested in integrating into your programs, or Is there any feedback as to why perhaps integrating something like this would not work, or any questions or concerns around that?
Okay, we got one answer. It says, in the DV shelter I work in, many of these don't apply since they've already left the relationship. We do assess behavior issues. Safety planning is usually done on hotline calls prior to entering shelter. An answer that says we definitely want to integrate this into the process.
Okay, good. Well, we can talk a little more after the training and take some more questions, but this is something that if you, and I understand every environment is different and it may not work in every environment, but this is definitely something that I would encourage all of you to kind of take back to your shelters and maybe talk to the staff about getting pieces or some components or something like this to really have as that first interaction, that sort of orientation part, because it's really important to gauge what the parent's level of understanding is of their own child, and then see how that works if you have a chance to interact with a child in a counseling type setting or a play therapy type setting. So getting back to that trilogy of services, we had talked about, sorry, I have to go back. We had talked about the orientation, the education, and the counseling. I'm really trying to integrate all these one step at a time. So I'll go back to the education component, and that's really familiarizing the child with the dynamics of domestic violence, personal safety measures, and mission of shelter. So again, I'm sure that all of the shelters look different. Some of you may have trained licensed counselors on staff. Many of you probably don't, and you're probably thinking, I wish, haha. But we have the opportunity to provide kind of more therapeutic interventions, not therapy, but therapeutic interventions that are education-based. And so this is kind of what we're getting into here, is that piece. And that just like, you know, we think of the things that we say about the folks that we serve, you know, that you can never say things like it's not your fault enough, or help is available, or you are not alone. All of these things that may seem like platitudes, but we know are really, really important in those conversations that we consistently have in the interactions. And we have to remember that children feel the same. And there's a training that I do where I kind of break down the impact of domestic violence and family violence on the child through the developing lifespan. And we look at how witnessing violence or being in a home where violence is present really disrupts or interrupts each of those developmental phases and the impact that it can have on the development of the child. But some of the greater universal truths that we know is that many children believe that either caused the violence, made it worse, or could have prevented it. And this is something that we really, really have to work hard. Just like victims think, if I just wasn't argumentative, or if I just had this or that, you know, my abuser wouldn't get so angry, my abuser wouldn't do this. Children also believe that they have a lot more control over situations than they actually do. So educating on that, realizing that we have to be really intentional about the developmental age of the child and not just chronological age. And I know that this is not an ACE training or a trauma training, but you know, that sort of early foundational years, that birth to 3, birth to 4, there is so much intellectual development in that executive functioning part of the brain. But when a child doesn't feel that the environment is stable, or they didn't receive the nurturing that they could have because of violence in the home, this really disrupts this sort of cognitive development and impacts behaviors and impacts risk-taking and this executive functioning. So we really need to understand that we tend to want to say this child is 3 or 4, so they should understand this and that and the other. But we really need to take into account the developmental age and not just the chronological age of the child. And this may be appropriate even in small children's groups or things that we do in shelter. We may have a 5-year-old that doesn't belong with the older kids. It may be more appropriate to be working with the younger kids. So just really being aware of that. I mentioned groups, and this can be provided and often is more effective in groups. Just like victims are often isolated, this is the same for children. So they may not have ever had a safe space or an environment where they could have that peer support and that social support. And play and social interaction and peer groups is so important for children. And so sometimes when we're doing this kind of education and we have the ability to do it in a group, it could be more effective. And this is most likely what shelters will be doing for outreach clients. So we may be doing group one-on-one work with children, but we also may be able to provide it in groups. So looking at that and looking at how to work those groups and publicize them is really important. And then that part of community education. So garnering support for families and working with families and children and figuring out how to educate the public about the fact that 2/3 of our residents are children, and that when we can work with families together, our outcomes and our progress as a society is probably going to be better. So education at a minimum should communicate the following. And this is, of course, things that you already know, but it never hurts to reiterate. The child's not at fault. The child cannot have stopped the abuse. Tendency of violence to escalate. Help children understand why a parent left the home. Explain the roles of law enforcement, criminal justice workers, counselors, etc., anyone the child may be interacting with. Because when we arm that child with information, we definitely empower the child to understand and to be able to make predictions about what to expect, and it just makes them feel more in control. Calling 911 and communicating important information, and of course in today's day and age that probably involves how to pick up a cell phone and swipe and hit that red button and stay on the phone. So of course keeping up with the access that the child might have, and safety planning. And just like safety planning is an organic kind of process with adults, it is the same with children. And that safety planning needs to look different depending on where that child is in the phase of the situation, the child's age, when things change. This needs to be an ongoing experience informed by the child. So the third part that we have is the counseling. And I don't know how many of you are able to provide counseling type services or if that's part of the scope of services that you provide. But I think it's an important part of discussing either how to either provide it or access it. And so part of this is, of course, a needs assessment, and this is the journey to healing. And this includes both crisis-mandated and ongoing counseling. May also be part of outreach services provided by the shelter. Should be regularly delivered by a trained staff member. I know that some shelters contract out these services, but studies show that children benefit significantly from a weekly or more session with a trusted adult. In the shelter environments that I worked in, whether we were providing it to shelter clients or to outreach, we really try to at least schedule it for 30 to 40 minutes at a minimum once a week. We know that that frequency and dosage is really, really important. And sort of having a case plan of sorts, starting from that baseline of that pre-child parent safety planning and that survey to kind of know where we're starting and some of the goals we have in working with the child. Should include at a minimum crisis counseling and stabilization, which is always the first order of business. Informal chats, group sessions whenever possible because, again, that peer component is important. And then figuring how to include guided activities like art, music, journaling, and play. So, of course, we know that people learn more when they do. So being able to get the child involved in activities during those sessions is really, really important. So now I have a question for you. If you can, how many of the folks on the phone have a child counseling component in the shelter environment where they work? Does anybody on the phone have any kind of counseling component for children?
It looks like it's about half and half. We've got a couple that have some on site. One has a volunteer, and then several either do not offer it or will refer to outside counselors.
Okay, so about half and half?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, that's what we discovered when we pulled some shelters back in 2015. So it looks like it's probably around the same now. Thank you for that input. So the most important thing is that we know that baseline, the child feels safe and comfortable and has a trusting relationship with this adult. So this is not rocket science, right? Having an adult that the child feels is sort of an advocate for them, is on their side, they can connect with that person understands them, and they feel safe. Sharing things that they've probably never said to anyone else is very, very important. Some of the best practices is that DD shelters should have a system in place to facilitate screening children for mental health concerns and makes appropriate referrals. And so, of course, we all know that probably the strongest tool we have in our toolbox is the ability to connect to other resources. Now, I do not want to fail to mention that I understand, based on the geography and the layout and how every part of the state is different, that there are some areas where these resources are much more abundant, and then areas where resources are either scarce or non-existent. In fact, I think I told you all that I train CPS workers, assessment workers, and investigators in TBI, and I can't tell you the number of times that I have folks come up and say, I don't know what to do, I work in this county, and there is nothing for X, Y, and Z. And so I do want to acknowledge that I understand that sometimes, even though this can be our strongest tools, the resources just don't exist. So how do we start to work on that, going back to that education piece, and really advocate for those services in the communities, or maybe find volunteers or other folks who may be willing to help us with this challenge that we have. An important component in all of this is periodic sessions with the parents specifically about their children. So making sure that we're not only working with the child, if at all possible, but that we're also setting aside time specifically dedicated to talk to the parent about the concerns with the child or their
Jennifer, we seem to have lost your audio. right, everybody, it looks like Jennifer got disconnected. I think she's working on getting back on the line now. If you'll just give us one moment.
Hi, are you still there?
We are. We've got you back.
I am so sorry. The call just disconnected. I was in the middle of saying something. I apologize for that. I called right back. So, of course, I was talking about the importance of making sure that we set aside time to speak with the parents specifically about their children and really including that in our scope of services. So here's the part where we acknowledge that it all sounds great and that probably a lot of you know a lot of this, and in a perfect world, every shelter would have a robust, fully funded children's program. But let's be real, right? There are a lot of obstacles. We face a lot of obstacles in implementing and sustaining children's services, both in shelter and to outreach clients. And this is really for myriad reasons. Funding is probably a major one. Our advocates and our crisis techs are overtaxed. In running the statewide shelter and providing services to a lot of shelters that roll over their evening and weekend calls so that their advocates aren't working 3 days straight, asking to put one more thing on the plate is oftentimes such a tall order. And so that is definitely something that is an issue. The shelter environment is often chaotic and unpredictable. We have a population that's transient. You know, children come and go frequently. It may be hard to maintain contact with families once they leave shelter. So if they're in shelter for a few weeks and then we want to try to continue providing outreach services, is that possible? How do we maintain contact with these families? Children receiving outreach services may not be consistent in keeping appointments. And parents are reluctant to commit to long-term services because they're not sure that they will be able to actually make the appointments, transportation, just a lot of things are working against us here. And the truth is that there's no one solution to filling the gap of this incredible need. But as we have heard time and time again, we have to be creative and educate others. And if there's one thing I can say about folks that work in crisis centers and domestic violence and sexual assault centers is that you are the most creative, innovative, solution-driven people that I have ever come in contact with. And the things that I see advocates and workers in these environments doing really is mind-blowing because there's so much happening with so little resources. We already know that providing services to child witnesses of DV does the following. We know it improves academic performance. It puts less stress on the parent because it addresses probably their primary concern, leads to fewer instances of child witnesses ending up in juvenile detention facilities. And of course, the longer-term societal goal is it leads to less DV in society over time. So these are just, I've done a similar training with EDs before, and there were some things about funding that I've gone over with them. So if I have any EDs on the phone or any folks that work on grants and things like that, if you're interested in maybe getting some more information on some of the stuff I shared, I'd be happy to do that, but I knew we would have a diverse population here. But just some of the kinds of ways of being creative that I've seen in different environments is something like an after-school shelter tutoring program that was provided by the school system 5 days a week after school for 2.5 hours. So in the shelter that I worked, they were able to lobby to get the school system to provide teachers that came to the shelter Monday through Friday and worked with the children living in shelter on homework and different things like that for 2.5 hours during the school year. Screen Volunteer Corps, including teachers, worked with children doing art and music activities in the summer. So really harnessing that volunteer force that comes with a lot of different skills, getting them that basic advocate training, teaching them about crisis intervention and adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, and then letting them bring in their gifts that they have into the shelter to really provide that kind of those opportunities that children who have been living in these types of situations often haven't been provided with. And then scholarship programs to local aftercare programs and camps, which may or may not include transportation. And time to share. So again, designating an advocate who maybe once a week takes the children and does a group with them is definitely something that a shelter can do if they've got the workforce for it. So overcoming these obstacles, again, continuing on this, clearly defining clients. Children should always be considered primary clients, not secondary clients. Understanding that violence is a family problem. This really helps frame the issue for policymakers, funding agencies. As you know, we go and try to advocate for more funding and more resources. This education is important because we have to shift this paradigm. Tracking. Most of you do this anyway for statistics purposes. You have to report to grants, you have to show your outcomes, but really tracking community engagement too, making sure you're tracking volunteers, businesses, agencies, in kind, showing that you're receiving support from the community, and being able to demonstrate the need. And really being creative with showing what we're doing without having the resources to do it is really, really important as well. Recognizing the power of networks, shelter networks, learn from each other, best practices. I know the coalition provides a lot of opportunities for that. Our care networks, our professional service providers, shelters cannot and should not be the sole providers of these services. Service networks, key parties you interface with often, get them involved. Law enforcement, healthcare workers, child abuse prevention agencies, child advocacy centers, and all the folks really doing some type of work around building those safe, stable, and nurturing environments and preventing violence. So really understanding the power of networks and how that collective impact is really important. We want to operate according to the life cycle model. And this is a continuous strategy of planning, operating, and expanding services for children. When looking to develop a children's program or strengthen, expand an existing program, be sure to utilize research that provides a holistic perspective on the life cycle of the domestic violence service delivery system and emphasizes those crucial elements of the system that support and sustain efforts to develop effective programs and services for child victims of domestic violence. And basically what this means is that there is plenty of research that exists that shows the long-term benefits and outcomes of these strategies. And so we want to consistently highlight those, and we want to use it to inform our best practices, any kind of program adjustments or new programs or programs expansion, and try to use it to garner that community support that we had talked about. Healing Child Witnesses of DV addresses the needs of survivors and prevents future violence. This we know to be a fact. And so I'll end today by leaving you with a quote, and then we should have a few minutes for questions. And again, I'm happy to provide my email address too in case you would like any resources. And I know, again, the coalition has so much resource, extensive resource database available for you. But this is a quote that I use when we're talking about serving children and really what this looks like in the long term. It says, "The truth about childhood is stored up in our bodies and lives in the depths of our souls. Our intellect can be deceived, our feelings can be numbed and manipulated, our perception is shamed and confused, our bodies tricked with medication, but our soul never forgets. And because we are one whole soul in one body, someday our body will present its bill." And I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to definitely take a look at the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. There's a fantastic little TED Talk by Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. I know that Heather knows it well. She and I have presented together. It's about 16 minutes, and it talks about childhood trauma and how it impacts us through our life. So if you get a chance, I would really encourage you to do that. And thank you so much for your time today. I think we've got some time for questions. So are we going to use the chat feature too, Heather, for this?
Yes, we are. If you want to just type your questions in the chat feature, we've got a couple already. The first one is, Can something as simple as a family game night once a week be beneficial to children in shelter?
Absolutely. Um, this is, of course, we want to aim high, but something is better than nothing at all, especially something that engages families and also is focused on fun and being playful. And we can never, ever, ever underestimate the power of harnessing joy and play, even for a short period of time, in such a oftentimes chaotic environment. So being mindful about taking the time to say, hey, we're going to get together and we're going to play. And we're going to have a good time, and we're going to remember what it is to laugh and to not be stressed for even a period of time. And we're going to do this, children and adults alike. I think that that's a great way to start.
Okay. One person wants to know, will you share your slides after the...
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Wonderful.
For sure. I'll actually email it to you, Heather, and then you can send it out.
Perfect, and then I can distribute to everyone. Let's see. What is your recommendation for implementing screening for children for mental health concerns?
So I think that looking for some tools. We obviously need to be careful about, you know, screening for and saying somebody needs this, or, you know, anything that comes close to diagnosing people is something that we definitely want to steer very, very clear from. But the truth is that I think if there are assessments out there that if a child is meeting certain markers in terms of behavior, and we know that the child has been in a violent environment, then definitely some kind of counseling or therapy would be appropriate. So Heather, I don't know if you all have any kind of screenings that you recommend or suggest for domestic violence shelters, but trying to find, I think, always some kind of a validated or an evidence-based tool to at least know when it's appropriate to make referrals, and really try to get those out to the shelters and kind of be uniform with them is probably the best way to go. So I can't recommend any specifically, but I can tell you that they exist, and that may be something that they can work with you all on in integration in their program.
Absolutely. We have a few that we recommend for adults. We don't necessarily have particular ones for children, but that's something that we can absolutely kind of look into and disseminate what we find.
And also, I want to make one more recommendation. If you can get release forms signed, they may actually also be able to work with the school system, depending on the age of the child, and, you know, collect with teachers and social workers. They may also be able to provide referrals for those services as well.
It looks like that's the last of our questions.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to send out the slides to Heather. It's got my email address and my phone number on it. Please don't hesitate to send me an email or reach out if you have any additional questions. It's always nice being able to work with you all, and I appreciate your time today.
Right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And for everybody on the line, I will be sending out follow-ups with any information. Please feel free to send me questions as well if you would like any guidance or resources. And I will remind you that when everything closes out, you'll have a screen that pops up that is an evaluation. We would love for you to fill that out. For both Jennifer and I use those things for grant purposes. And there's also a section on that evaluation that if you have other staff who are listening along with you, you can enter their name so that we can get an accurate count of how many people were listening. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. Have a great one.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.